In the First World War, amidst the deafening roar of artillery and the rattle of machine guns, it was the steady, relentless hoofbeats of over 1 million horses that truly powered the battlefield. These animals were the army's unsung workhorses, holding artillery guns, waking tons, hauling wagons laden with supplies, and carrying critical messages across treacherous terrain where motor vehicles dared not tread. Every march, every charge, every supply convoy relied on these beasts of burden, and the men who cared for them. The military veterinarians waged their own quiet battle to keep them alive. This is their story, the untold struggle behind the war's hoofbeats. Veterinary medicine in Europe was born from crisis. In the 18th century, deadly livestock epidemics, rinderpest, anthrax, foot and mouth disease, and contagious lung infections swept through armies and farms alike, crippling food supplies and military transport. Something more than the traditional farrier's craft was needed. France took the first step in 1761, founding the world's first veterinary school in Lyon, where animal health was studied with the same scientific rigor as human medicine. Austria-Hungary followed in 1765 with a school in Vienna, soon became the center of veterinary science in the German-speaking world. The curriculum included deep study of infectious diseases, anatomy, and even emergent sanitation protocols, reflecting a new scientific approach to animal health. During a debate in the Prussian House of Representatives in September 1862, Dr. Virchow stated that the current royal government also believed that the true significance of veterinarians in the army lay in shoeing horses. Until this position was abandoned, it would not be possible to expect scientifically trained veterinarians. Quote unquote, the veterinarian should be a farrier. The farrier cannot be an officer. Therefore, the veterinarian cannot be an officer. Another member of parliament summed it up. Yet another member of parliament, a cavalry captain, complained that due to insufficient opportunities for advancement in the military, the highest rank was sergeant, it was unlikely that candidates from educated classes would apply. So, in Prussia, a deep-rooted military tradition held fast to old ways into the 19th century. Care for horses remained largely in the hands of riding farriers or flag farriers, skilled craftsmen who specialized in shoeing and manner treatment, but lacked formal scientific training. This reliance on experience over expertise put Prussia behind neighboring German states. Other states introduced military veterinarians much earlier. Bavaria appointed its first chief army veterinarian in 1817, Württemberg in 1819, Baden in 1862, and Hessen-Darmstadt in 1868. Württemberg was so convinced of its merits of its military veterinary system that in the 1870s it attempted to persuade Prussia to reorganize its system along the same lines. Prussia, despite being Europe's military powerhouse, lagged behind. It did not create its first inspector of military veterinary service until 1873. And even then, this body was placed under the command of a cavalry officer, not a veterinarian. This reflected a persistent belief that horse care was more about horsemanship than medical science. The army was slow to accept the professional autonomy of veterinarians, maintaining the misconception that horse care was an extension of horsemanship, not a medical specialty. Only gradually did the importance of the veterinary medicine in the military gain recognition. In 1874, the War Ministry began to separate shoeing from medical duties, but reforms were slow. By 1902, veterinary officers had to hold at least a secondary school diploma, raising the bar for professionalism. In 1903, a Supreme Cabinet order was issued that initiated reform of the military veterinary service. The job title veterinarian, which had previously only been used in Bavaria, was introduced across the board. The most important point, however, was that the formation of a veterinary officer corps was proposed. In 1908, the Reichsregie, or the Ministry of Finance, expressed its fundamental agreement to the creation of a veterinary officer corps, but the expected additional costs could not be provided for at first due to the extremely unfavorable financial situation of the Reich. So it asked the War Ministry to postpone the project until more favorable financial conditions returned. Finally, on April 1, 1910, the Prussian army official established its veterinary officer corps. In 1913, there were already 728 officers, yet only 4.94% or 36 officers held staff officer ranks, one general veterinarian and 35 corps staff veterinarians with the rank of a major. The rank of lieutenant colonel was completely absent until July 1917. Upon reaching the position of regimental veterinarian in the staff veterinarian service, the general career goal was achieved. This reflected the ongoing struggle to integrate veterinarians into the military hierarchy as respected professionals rather than mere auxiliaries. Compared to other officer careers, there was a significant shortage of higher ranks. Even after the Corps creation, veterinary officers struggled for recognition and leadership. Inspections of epidemic control, stable hygiene, feed quality, and hoof care were conducted by cavalry officers, being trained in riding and combat, experienced in horsemanship, but lacking the detailed knowledge required to prevent or control disease outbreaks, or manage nutrition scientifically. Professor Dr. Schmalz, a Berlin anatomy professor and founder of the Berliner Tierärztliche Wochenzeitschrift, championed the cause for reform. He argued that the veterinary corps deserved respect, professional dignity, and economic efficiency. He insisted that a veterinary officer trained extensively in infectious diseases, feed analysis, and chewing techniques was far better equipped to lead inspections than a cavalry officer with a limited scientific background, because the inspector-in-chief was responsible for matters like epidemic prevention, feed safety, and hoof care, areas demanding expert veterinary knowledge rather than basic horsemanship. In 1913, the campaign bore fruit. A veterinary officer was appointed inspector-in-chief for the first time. However, this position was usually temporary, lasting only 2 years before the officer returned to a regimental post. This practice hampered consistent policy implementation and professional leadership. Exceptions like Lieutenant Colonel von Liebig, who served 7 years as Inspector-in-Chief, and Colonel Dreher, who held the post for a decade from 1902 to 1912, were rare, but more often the inspector role was viewed as a stepping stone to regimental command, reflecting lingering military attitudes that undervalued veterinary science. Within the outbreak of war, the veterinary corps faced its greatest test. Germany's mobilization was swift and massive. 3 million soldiers and 1 million horses were assembled within 17 days. 715,000 horses were requisitioned from civilians during the first wave. Alone, more than 6,000 artillery pieces were prepared for deployment. On the eve of the First World War, Germany's military veterinary service stood on shaky ground. Despite repeated warnings from experts, no comprehensive preparations had been made. The prevailing belief in Berlin's military circles was that any future war would be short-lived, with replacement horses easily drawn from civilian stock. In this vision, veterinary medicine was an afterthought, its role in sustaining mobility and combat effectiveness gravely underestimated. Unlike the well-organized medical corps, there was no dedicated war veterinary order to unify policy and practice. Regulations lay scattered across a patchwork of manuals and decrees, leaving veterinary officers ill-prepared for the realities of wartime epidemic control, sanitation, and disease prevention. Specialized expertise, whether in surgery, internal medicine, or bacteriology, could not be deployed in any systematic way, as no infrastructure existed to support it. Only in late 1915 would this gap be addressed, and even then only partially. Material readiness was equally poor. At mobilization, units were expected to restock their own horse medicine chests, while field supply came from staged medical depots designed primarily for human needs. It was only shortly before war broke out that these depots received basic veterinary equipment, bandages, disinfectants, and a few surgical tools, making it possible to set up the most rudimentary horse hospitals. Logistically, the army could load and unload horses from trains with astonishing speed, sometimes several times in a single day. Veterinary supplies, however, often lagged far behind the front. Many vets had no choice but to rely on what they could carry in their personal saddlebags, compact kits that became the lifeline for countless animals. These saddlebags were carefully packed to meet the demands of field medicine. Thermometers for fever detection, hoof knives and rasps for injuries and maintenance, disinfections such as iodine and carbolic acid to clean wounds, and halt the spread of epidemics. Basic surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, sutures for emergency procedures, bandages, splints, needles, and thread for wound care. Medical vials for colic, infections, and parasites. Light enough to be slung over a horse, yet comprehensive enough for triage, these kits enabled veterinarians to work in brutal conditions, kneeling in mud, drenching in freezing rain, or under shell fire. When the German 10th Army Corps crossed into Belgium on the 4th of August 1914 to begin the siege of Liege, the strain on horses was immediate. Under existing regulations, wartime control of veterinary service lay with the General War Department of the War Ministry. But at mobilization, the military veterinary inspection was dissolved. The Veterinary Academy reduced in size, and both its officers and assistant veterinarians were sent back with their units. Even veterinary students who had completed just 5 semesters were dispatched as field assistants to corps in special need. No horse hospital system had been foreseen, as the army's advanced horses that could not keep up simply died along the roadside, their carcasses and sometimes still living bodies marking the path of the war. By 1915, mounting losses and outbreak of epidemic disease forced the War Ministry to establish a proper hospital network. In the interim, veterinarians improvised makeshift collection points from whatever resources they could find. Even after new plans were approved, shortages persisted. To address them, the army partnered with two specialized firms to produce veterinary saddlebags, panniers, medicine chests, and even dedicated veterinary supply and ambulance wagons for the emerging horse hospitals. By war's end, 478 such facilities, field, stage, home and specialized, had been created, treating at least 1,372,000 animals. No centralized reporting system existed at first. When one was introduced, it was dismissed as overly bureaucratic, limited to horses and plagued by poor maintenance. Many wartime reports were lost in the post-war years. The total number of horses used or lost can only be estimated. A 1970 War Veterinary report counted an average of 1,236,000 horses in the field army alone, excluding those in home and occupation forces. Losses for the field army likely reached 1 million. At mobilization, Germany had 766 active veterinary officers and 1,507 in reserve. Over the course of the conflict, 5,354 veterinarians, roughly 75% of all in the country, served in uniform. Of these, 241 died from combat or war-related causes, including 9 core staff or senior vets, 14 senior staff vets, 67 staff veterinarians, 60 senior veterinarians, and 34 junior, field or field assistant vets. The war's first months were brutal for the horses, who often marched 30 to 40 kilometers daily. They pulled heavy artillery and supply wagons over uneven terrain, cobblestones, mud, rocky fields that caused a variety of injuries. Saddle and harness sores worsened by sweat, friction and ill-fitting gear, split wounds and puncture wounds from loose nails and sharp stones. Colic and laminitis caused by irregular feeding and exhaustion. Respiration infection from sleeping in damp, cold stables or open fields. During the early, highly mobile phase of the war, military veterinarians struggled to provide proper care. Examinations and treatments were often limited to brief rest stops or after units had reached their quarters or bivouac, sometimes only after arriving in darkness and departing before dawn. Replacement horses drawn from civilian depots arrived in widely varying condition. Many were undernourished, weak or infected with contagious diseases such as mange, strangles or glanders. Units with their own remote depots could treat and rehabilitate such animals, but others relied on stage depots, which often refused psychosis to avoid infecting their own stock. On the march, veterinary officers focused mainly on providing first aid and removing unfit animals from the column. These were sent to the main baggage train via the combat baggage train. Otherwise, units sometimes had no choice but to shoot them or leave them behind. Regulations required stage horses depots to accept seriously ill horses, but as their main role was supplying replacements, the epidemic risk led many depots to turn them away. As sick animals began to accumulate among the baggage trains, some regiments improvised small collection points for minor cases and assigned veterinarians to them. Units without permanent veterinary staff, such as infantry regiments, signal troops, engineer battalions, and medical companies, suffered the highest losses and frequently spread diseases by late detection, poor treatment, abandonment, or using captured horses without prior inspection. Initially, the only auxiliary staff available to veterinarians were blacksmiths, who were already fully occupied with shoeing, often unavailable at all in infantry and technical units despite their horse numbers. Conditions on the Eastern Front placed exceptional strain on both animals and veterinarians. Prolonged mobile operations over rutted, muddy tracks, unhygienic accommodations, and the early onset of the Russian winter. Marches over snow and ice-covered roads, frozen watering points, and exhausted animals demanded constant treatment. In February 1916, Division Commander Otto von Moser described an outbreak of mange in Dünaburg. Quote-unquote, "Our veterinarians now have an extremely strenuous job. My particularly dutiful staff veterinarian Krüger is constantly on the road. No small feat in this weather." By late 1915, the army began introducing 2-horse veterinary ambulances, allowing quicker evacuation of injured animals to mobile facilities and eventually horse hospitals. As the war stalemated into trench warfare, the constant marching ceased, but horses faced new threats. Horses stayed in one location for weeks or months, increasing exposure to infectious diseases like glanders, erysipelas, and strangles. The cramped and dirty conditions of stables amplified infection risks. Veterinary officers shifted from emergency treatment to through preventive care. Disinfecting stables, regular grooming, hoof cleaning, and feed management became critical tasks. As the front gradually solidified, things got easier for the military veterinary service. The units stayed longer in their quarters, which meant the horses stayed longer on their stables, allowing the veterinary service to do its job in an organized way. Even the horses of units that didn't have their own military veterinary service could be better examined and cared for by vets. The first priority was to restore the animals, which had been weakened and emaciated by the stresses of mobile warfare, to full field service as quickly as possible and to monitor their health through regular horse inspections. Supplies of materials had to be replenished, which was difficult on the eastern front, in particular due to the long distances to the unloading stations or staging areas. Of particular importance for the troops' ability to march was the control of war animal disease, whose spread was facilitated by the constant strain on the animals, poor housing conditions, and inadequate feeding. The first diseases to be mentioned here are glanders, erysipelas, and strangles. The first two diseases did not gain much significance, especially since Salvarsan and Neosalvarsan made it possible to treat glanders, and surviving the diseases led to partial lifelong immunity. In contrast, strangles caused considerable losses. As the troops advanced, glanders and mange appeared in the east, and Brussels disease, lymphangitis, epizootica, and above all, contagious anemia soon appeared in the west in an alarming manner. The overall breed selection became more strategic. East Prussian and Hanoverian warmbloods for artillery and cavalry, medium cold blood breeds like the Rhenish Belgian for heavy draft, Spaniel ponies on the eastern front, prized for navigating narrow forest paths and surviving harsh winters. Throughout the war, veterinary officers waged an invisible but vital campaign against disease, wounds, exhaustion, and malnutrition. Veterinary officers fought a relentless invisible war against disease, injury, and exhaustion. Working under shell fire, in flooded trenches, snowstorms, and scorching heat, they faced overwhelming challenges, often with minimal supplies. The patients could not speak. A horse's limp, fever, or dull eye was their only sign of suffering. Diagnosing an outbreak early or recognizing subtle signs of lameness could mean the difference between saving a horse and preserving the mobility of entire divisions. The patients could not voice pain. Only the officer's knowledge and observation saved them. A horse returning to duty was a silent victory, a preserved lifeline for the army's mobility. Despite their crucial role, veterinary officers' efforts remained largely unrecognized. Despite the scale of their work, veterinary officers rarely made headlines. A horse returning to service was seen as a routine. A disease outbreak prevented was rarely recorded as a victory. Yet, without these men, the German army's ability to move artillery, food, and men would have collapsed within weeks. Mobilization disrupted peacetime veterinary inspections and training programs. Many veterinary students were harshly drafted as assistant veterinarians with limited experience. Initial shortages of medicine and equipment forced regiments to maintain their own medicine chests and veterinary field kits. The development of specialist saddlebags and two-horse veterinary ambulances improved the mobility and efficiency of veterinary care over the course of the war. The saddlebags evolved from simple leather pouches to sophisticated kits with multiple compartments, enabling officers to carry everything from surgical instruments to disinfectants in a compact, accessible format. In a war remembered for mechanized weapons, poison gas, and tanks, it is easy to overlook the steady heartbeat of their armies, the horses. The military veterinary service was the unseen lifeline that kept these vital animals alive and moving through the chaos of war. Behind every artillery barrage, every supply convoy, and every cavalry charge was the tireless work of veterinarians, fighting disease, injury, and exhaustion in impossible conditions. This story is one not of glory, but of endurance, a testament to the men who saved the lives that made the war itself possible. So that's it for today. Thank you all for watching. Have a good one and see you next time. Bye.